So we're at the very beginning of another leg of my epic journey around Europe and beyond. I'm at Athens Airport as the sun starts to set, and in a couple of hours I'll be boarding an Aegean Airlines flight from here down to Cairo in Egypt. It takes off at about midnight and lands at about 2 in the morning, so that should be fun. All part of my voyage to explore as many European business class products as possible, part of my journey towards Star Alliance Gold, and a way of getting out of Europe to somewhere interesting for the first time in about 2 years. So if you'd like to see what the experience is like, stick around! Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So hit subscribe to see where I go next and perhaps get some inspiration for your next trip. I had 7 hours between arriving on my Swiss flight and departing on Aegean. I'd contemplated heading into Athens, but it was already getting dark and I had a better opportunity to visit the city on my way home, so after mooching around outside the terminal for an hour or so, I decided to see if I could go through to the lounge so at least I could get some work done while I waited. So if you enter the Athens terminal through the central entrance, the Aegean check-in area is right in front of you. Signs indicated that this was a temporary location, although it looked like prime real estate to me. I checked in and printed off a boarding pass from home, but with an abundance of caution I passed by the check-in desks. They seemed disinterested in my paperwork, and I'd find out why later. Now, after analysing all of the options for achieving status with a Star Alliance airline, I'd chosen to join the Aegean scheme. I made a couple of videos about that process, which you can find here. I chose Aegean because I thought the mix of their qualification requirements, re-qualification requirements and redemption options were the best out there. But in addition to all that dull stuff, they have a reputation of being a good airline to fly, and some of the reviews I've seen were very positive. Now, being a member of their scheme doesn't mean I have to fly them regularly, and it may be the case that I don't fly them at all. But after having a positive experience from joining their scheme, I felt that they were my airline. I felt oddly protective of them, and I really wanted the experience to be great. It turns out that Athens Airport has 2 wings, A and B, and Aegean flies from the A wing. I travelled through the B wing when heading home, and I can report that B is where you want to be. So despite being the home airline, Aegean is in the less desirable side of the airport, and the lounge really isn't that great, which was a little disappointing given I had about 5 hours there. The food was actually very tasty and was quite varied, despite perhaps not presenting all that well. There was also wine and beer, although no spirits. But I did some editing, did some scripting, and used my Surfshark VPN to spoof the internet into thinking I was still in the UK, allowing me to watch some TV I'd missed. Everyone should protect their data with a VPN when travelling, and I have an offer from Surfshark in the description below. So the lounge and the terminal weren't living up to the polished quality of Aegean's online presence, and it got worse from there. My flight left at 11:40 PM, about the same time as flights to Yerevan and Beirut, the last 3 flights of the day. These 3 flights departed from gates at the end of the A wing of the terminal, just beyond a natural bottleneck in the terminal's layout. What Aegean, in their wisdom, had decided to do was implement a documents checkpoint right at the neck of the bottleneck. I didn't really capture the true horror of the queue, but 3 flights full of people were lined up down a narrow corridor so their documents could be individually checked before accessing the gates. There was no signage and no crowd control, and I initially had no idea what was going on, so walked past 95% of the queue before realising it was a queue I should have been in. This ended up being the most spectacular episode of queue jumping of my entire life, as they just jostled me into the queue right by the checkpoint, and I was through in perhaps 5 minutes. The planning was abysmal, there was no consideration of business class passengers, and as it was past 11 PM, tempers were starting to fray. The gate area was also very disorganised, and when boarding started it was not clear whether there was priority boarding or whether it was just a free-for-all. I'd been up and travelling for about 20 hours by this point, so just joined in and got aboard. Social distancing was completely ignored, although mask use was enforced. First impressions of the plane, an Airbus A321, were very positive. Decent legroom, I'd say 31 inches of pitch. The middle seat was kept free and enhanced with a mini table thingy. My seatback table had a slidey function, and there was a pretty nifty pop-out tablet holder thingy that would be pretty good for holding your own device, as there is no in-seat entertainment. In-seat power too, a clever location for the USB port as well, being adjacent to the tablet holder. Quite interesting that a hefty magazine was offered too. Most airlines gave them up years ago as a cost and fuel saving measure, and almost all of the rest ditched them as being a COVID risk. But Aegean perseveres with the literature and complements it with a separate on-board shopping magazine. Comfy seats with decent headrests too. About the only thing missing was in-flight Wi-Fi. 4 rows of business on this flight, and as with most airlines, the curtain can be moved to meet demand, although it was a fairly hefty curtain that I'd imagine would take a fair bit of moving. It was pushing midnight when we took off, so not great views, but I need to use some footage while I say this next bit. Our flight was scheduled to depart at 11:40 p.m, arriving into Cairo at 1:40 in the morning. There was then a 3-hour turnaround for a 4:40 a.m. departure back to Athens, arriving at 6:40 in the morning. Basically, this was an awful overnight duty that, alongside the parallel departures to Beirut and Yerevan, were probably the absolute worst trips on the Aegean roster. I doubt these routings were scheduled to actively punish poor performing crew members, but I could tell that the crew were not enjoying themselves, and unfortunately that was reflected in the service. There was also some unpleasantness. 2 hulking great blokes self-upgraded into business class before takeoff. After lengthy scrutiny of the manifest, a petite female flight attendant challenged them. Their response was a very aggressive, "Is that a problem?" To her credit, the attendant was not intimidated and responded, "Yes, it is a problem," and the blokes moved. But it was quite an uncomfortable experience, and during the flight I also overheard some rowdiness behind the curtain in economy. All things considered, I can understand why the crew was not having fun. It's not an excuse for delivering poor service, but it could be seen as an explanation for it. So 35 minutes after takeoff, the only service items I'd received were a menu and a tablecloth. Now, providing tablecloths is an excellent detail, something very few other airlines do on a 2-hour flight. But if it's not backed up with good service, it's actually just annoying. The food arrived about 10 minutes later. No pre-dinner drinks were offered, and the meal was delivered without any real fanfare. I had pre-ordered the beef, which was pretty good. That starter salad included carob rusks, which I'd not previously encountered, a very Greek ingredient which I applaud, even if I didn't particularly enjoy them. But the meal was ambitious, sizable, and for the most part was delicious. Wine was offered shortly after, although the crew then disappeared behind the curtain. There were 4.5 of us in the business cabin, the half being an infant, so it was not a hard cabin to service, so it was a very disappointing experience. I could of course have dinged the bell, but I wanted to let things play out organically. When the dinner was cleared, I did ask for a Metaxa brandy, which was enthusiastically delivered, and I was offered a refill, but I think the overall negative impression had already been set by that point. A teeny tiny loo, as is standard on Airbuses of this kind. We landed into Cairo on time, still very dark, so not brilliant footage, but it was still great to be out of Europe for the first time in 20 months. I was quickly off the plane and quickly through the checkpoint where passenger locator forms were collected. You were given one on the plane, but you can find them online and fill them in advance. The airport was quiet at 2 a.m, and I was through the formalities very quickly and efficiently.
Hello.
I'd obtained a visa online before flying, but you could easily buy one on arrival. I'll talk more about Cairo in an upcoming video. So, the return leg. Before we get stuck in, can I invite you to like this video? If you've made it this far, it's probably worth a quick click. Leave me a comment and subscribe if you're new. As I mentioned earlier, the return flight departed at 4:40 a.m, precipitating a 2:15 alarm call. It was going to be another long day. Like many airports in the developing world, there's a security checkpoint when you enter the terminal before you reach the check-in desks. This can be a bit confusing if you're not expecting it, and it's a fairly unsubtle security check. They're not worried about whether your toothpaste is too large. That comes later. Once through that checkpoint, you can check in. As usual, even though I checked in online, I still visited the desk and got a physical boarding pass. Then to a passport checkpoint, which was very quiet at that time of the morning, and a moderate hike to the lounge. Aegean uses the Egypt Air Lounge, being Star Alliance buddies, and although the signage was a little ambiguous, I quickly found it and settled in. I'd allowed an hour for all of the formalities, and they'd taken about 5 minutes, so I could have stayed in bed, but hey-ho. No alcohol with Egypt Air, but there was a wide array of single-use plastics available for you to scrunch and discard, all of which came with a morsel of food. Done this way, I'm sure, for hygiene reasons, although it was an environmentalist's nightmare. There must be a better way, and there is, as I will show you in my upcoming review of Lufthansa. Half the lounge was shut off, and the lady by the desk was a bit grumpy with me filming it as it was being cleaned, or so I was told. So time passed and I decided to wander along to the gate. A bit of an unusual setup in that the final security point, where they do worry about the size of your toothpaste, was right by the gate, but I was quickly through into a deserted gate area. This was a little confusing, but I quickly realised that the gate was wide open, so I just went straight through to the plane. As the plane had probably been on the ground for 3 hours, they obviously decided to throw boarding open very early and have people sitting on the plane rather than at the gate. Seat 2F this time, an identical aircraft to the outbound, so all the facilities were the same. I don't know whether this was a better crew, whether the fact that they were heading home perked them up, or whether the timing meant that it was an easier crowd to control, but the experience was much better heading back to Athens. Quite quickly after takeoff, a menu and the tablecloth arrived for you to play with, and then perhaps 15 minutes after takeoff, breakfast arrived. Ironically, you might have preferred to eat closer to landing given the timing of the flight, but that wasn't an option. Again, a substantial feed that was really quite good. The hot halloumi was exceptional. A proper Greek yogurt experience too. Coffees and teas, and you could have cracked into the booze if you really wanted, all delivered in a friendly and enthusiastic manner by the crew. Still not an overwhelming service experience, but much better than I'd experienced on the outbound sector. Not much footage of this flight as, dear viewer, after breakfast, I took a nap. I had another 7 hours in Athens ahead of me, and this time I did take the train into town, but I'll save that story for another day. We were the second flight into Athens that morning, a few minutes after a Scoot Air flight from Singapore, so I was rapidly through the formalities and into Greece. So Aegean. I really wanted them to be great, and in some critical ways, they weren't. I find it hard to fault the pre-flight experience. Planning and booking everything was great, as was the communication. All my flights registered into my miles and bonus account promptly and correctly, and the functionality I now have with some points to spend is excellent. I can't fault the strategic decisions the airline has taken. Smart new aircraft, good seats, and some service touches that really set the airline apart from their competition. But the Aegean staff I experienced didn't match the expectations that the pre-flight experience had set. The ground handling in Athens was very poor. I still shudder thinking about that checkpoint corridor. And the in-flight experience outbound, whilst perhaps understandable, did not make it excusable. I've shown a sample of 2 flights, so I'm in no way concluding that you should avoid Aegean. I'm already planning my next trip with them, which will accelerate my achievement of gold status with Star Alliance. But I will avoid those overnight flights if I possibly can, and if you decide to take one, be forewarned that the experience may not be the greatest Aegean offers. So thanks for watching, like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.